at least until that egg gets cold, to have a look at that list.
So I start off with God. Wash the apple. Go to the hall. Where there's a jet madly flying around. Into the dining room. Where there's an actress.
Who's your favourite actress?
Judi Dench. But she wouldn't be smeared in marmalade.
She would be.
Why?
So you can remember her.
For the next 5 minutes, I frantically try to imagine all these crazy images and think where to put them. The normally quite unexceptional Winston household will never feel quite the same again.
Do you think we can remember any of the words I gave you earlier today?
I'll start off outside in the garden. Wash apple. Jetman. Actress. Marmalade. Jetman. That's right. Bucket chain. Clock. Tile. Bottle. Sand.
They try to remember the room you were in when you thought of those words.
Salamander. Paper. Microphone call. Piano. Dog. Captain. Tennis. Kennel. Tomato.
How many out of 30 do you think you got?
Probably
All of them. Well done.
so it works.
Of course it does.
When we use a simple story to memorize facts, we're creating several pathways to where those memories are formed in the brain. It's as if instead of lining up one set of dominoes, we're setting up several. The reason we often have difficulties in retrieving a memory is because one neural pathway can easily get broken. But by having several different pathways to a memory, it means that if one doesn't manage to reach it, another one will. That's the advantage of the story technique. It creates lots of neural pathways in our brain. And all our brains can work in this way. Which is why everyone can use this method. By using a story to memorize facts, we all have potential to perform astonishing feats of memory.
So, just a little bit about how some of this story stuff works and why it works. I think the estimate is 22 times more memorable than dot points alone, so phenomenal difference. But did you notice the type of words that he was memorising? Anything sort of strike you in terms of the type of words that were being used? Nouns and very concrete nouns, right?
Yeah.
Dog, cat, tomato, that type of stuff. There was no abstract concepts. It's not collaboration or affinity or any of that type of language at all. And it's because it's really interesting. Once you start telling a story, you're forced into concrete language. Because you can't really tell a story about collaboration. But you can tell a story about a person walking in the room, sitting down and giving complete focus to the person they're working with. Now you're back down at that concrete level. And it's one of the reasons why when we get confused about anything, we sort of say, look, can you just give me an example? I just can't quite get my head around what you're talking about. So the stories are the thing that we naturally do. Who here would say that they're a natural storyteller? That's about the number I get nearly all the time, right? The thing is, there's some really interesting research done by a guy called Robin Dunbar. He's an evolutionary biologist. You might have heard of the Dunbar number in your sort of travels. The Dunbar number is the number of people you can sort of know who they are, know their names, know what they do, and it's about 150. It comes from size of brains and how the humans have developed. But that's not what we're talking about here. One of the things, little research projects he did, is he got his PhD students to go out into the city and just listen and eavesdrop into people's conversations and tag up the sort of things that they were talking about. And it turns out that something like 60% of the time we're actually speaking, we're talking about who did what to whom. No? What's who did what to whom normally called? Stories, it is stories. Gossip, that's right.
Kardashians.
So, you know, this is something that humans do, and it's an interesting thing that he said that he defined it very specifically. He sort of said, gossip is whenever you're speaking about someone when they're not in the room. So it turns out that a lot of that gossip that we actually share can be positive gossip. We're saying the good things, what other good things people are doing. It's how reputations are built, it's how that social lubricant, if you like, and how work gets done. It's how you work out who you trust and who you don't trust, and all that sort of stuff. Well, the only way in which we can do that, sharing who does what with whom, is through stories. So we're all storytellers. We're doing it all the time. So what we're talking about here is just taking something which is an innate skill and getting more systematic about it, getting more focused on how we actually do it. And one of the, I guess, the most important things you have to start off with is you have to be very good at pointing out what a story is and what's something that's not a story, right? Now I have a particular view on this, and I think it does differ a little bit from the agile general view. Because I know I would go into, let me see, NAB, and I would see these walls and they'd say story wall, you know, and I go, oh, fantastic, story wall, so I go over. But they're not what I would call a story. This is probably how the agile sees a story. So it'll be going to be interesting. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and the difference in what I'm talking about and what you're experiencing and the work that you're doing. I'm going to give you a little example. I did some work in the US recently for a big insurance company, and they were very excited about their story project. They collected stories from their employees, and all videoed stories. And so they sort of said, oh, we want you to have a look at these stories, you know, and the great work that we've done. Well, I had a look at the stories, and they nearly all had the feeling of something like this. There would be 3 or 4 people facing the camera. The first person would say things like, oh, gee, the Genworth is such a great company to work with. They really look after us. They have great facilities. Our sort of cafeteria is just top notch. You know? And then the next bit. Now, does this feel like a story to you? No, it's not a story at all. It misses all the story features, right? So that's what we need to get good at. We need to be able to sort of say, that's a story, this is not a story. And I find that sometimes people just have it. Like we got this little website I created because I was just so annoyed about people talking about story when they actually weren't telling stories. It's called thestorytest.com, and it just gives people 10 little snapshots of things, some of the things that are stories and some things that are not stories. And so I've seen, like, there's thousands of people who've done it now, and it's kind of really interesting. You get a lot of people who get 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10. To them it's a doll. They see the story and they go, yep, that's a story. And then they email me and they go, Shawn, what's the point of this? You know, this is so obvious. But then I get people who get 4 out of 10. Right? Lots of people who get 4 and 5 out of 10. No better than a coin flip. They just can't see stories. To them, everything's a story. Right? And they can argue to that. But that doesn't help you if you want to be good at story work. So let me just take you through a couple of things that I think about when I'm just trying to identify stories. The first one is really all stories, or a lot of stories, start out with a time marker. So when I say time marker, I mean when someone says, a few days ago, when I was over in Building N, or in 1991 when we did the restructure of this department and that department, on Tuesday, a while back. all these sort of phrases are time markers, and as soon as you hear that time marker, you can pretty be guaranteed that you're going to hear a story, right?
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time, I find it doesn't work in business. don't know, but that's the archetypal time marker, right? Now, if you remember Once Upon a Time, how does Star Wars start? Once upon a time
ago.
Yeah, a long time ago.
And
In
a galaxy far, far away. So you not only have a time, but a place, right? Because stories always happen in a time and a place. So once you've got that, you're given a pretty good chance of knowing that that's a story. But there's a couple other things that stories need to have. And by the way, what I'm telling you here is it's not a good story, right? This is just a story. The next thing, who would like to guess what the next thing is you have to have to know that it's a story? Sorry?
Events.
Events, that's right, absolutely. So this happens, and this happens. And of course, out of those events, we infer causality, right? Whether there's causality there or not, we will infer it. That's one of the beauties of story, and also something that sort of lets it down sometimes. But events. Okay, we've got events, we've got time markers. There's probably two other things that are important.
Place.
Yeah, we've got, event and place. Yeah, time and place. Characters, that's right. There's got to be about someone. In business, it's usually people. In entertainment, you can have Thomas the Tank Engine, right? So the thing about the people, one of the things you can listen for and really know you're hearing a story is dialogue, right? As soon as you hear dialogue, you know for certain that you're in a story. Because someone will sort of say, oh yeah, I bumped into Rob the other day. You know what, he's a funny bugger. He said that then you'll replay the dialogue of exactly what Robert said, right? And you know you're actually seeing an event, something that's actually happened. Now, with those sort of four things in mind, you can pinpoint a story. But let me just give you a story based on that criteria, and you tell me whether it's a story or not. Okay. So, I got up really early this morning, time marker, jumped in, had a shower, had my breakfast, drove out here, got organised for this this presentation and got started. So it's got events, it's got characters, it's got time markers.
And no dialogue.
There's no dialogue, but that's not necessary to have dialogue.
No inference I can make.
Yeah, what's missing?
No lessons.
No lessons. Boring, for one thing. There is one element that always sits in a story, right? And that is there's something always unanticipated. Right? I say unanticipated because it can be as small as someone tells you the story and you go, oh, no, it doesn't have to be, oh my God, what a great story. It just has to be enough that when you hear it, you go, gee, I didn't know that. Right? That's the elements, if you like, of the basics story. And it's a curse, once you know this, and a lot of you guys already would with the work that you do, you see stories all over the place. You'd be watching someone present and you'd be going, okay, there's a story. Oh, gee, no stories for a long time, it's a bit boring. Here's another story. So that's like a key, element. Now, there's another element in storytelling which I find really useful, is thinking about what I call the difference between big S and little s storytelling. Right? Let me just show you what I mean. Sort of a spectrum. Because what I find is a lot of people now who are getting into storytelling are coming from this big S end, right? These are the guys who are screenwriters and advertising guys and people who make, films and write books, all those sort of things. And they need to know about plot structures and character development, and it's quite a sophisticated art form, right, to be able to create a story in this end. I'm not so interested in this. I'm very much interested in what I call little S storytelling. It's the small anecdotes that happen that explain the day-to-day behaviours of what's happening in the workplace, right? And so the number of times I hear people talking about the hero's journey. Have you heard about the hero's journey? It's one of these plot structures that guys at this end just are in love with, right? They just can't get away. They think, you almost get the sense it's the only plot structure that is in existence, which is not the case, right? Just to give you a snapshot of the hero's journey, right? So it starts off, I think of Star Wars. It's the classic example of a hero's journey in the story. You start off with Luke. It always starts off with the character who's eventually going to be the hero. Starts off as a nobody, right? He's doing a nothing sort of thing. He's working with his aunt and uncle, tilling the land as a farmer. But then there's something happens that pushes him into a journey. He doesn't want to go. He always resists the journey. But in this case, his aunt and uncle get killed. He's forced into this journey. And at the beginning of the journey, he nearly always gets a mentor. Obi-Wan Kenobi sort of pops up on the scene. You should know that the mentor always dies. Right? So when my kids started reading Harry Potter and I get to Dumbledore, I go, fourth or fifth book, he's a goner. Right? I had to hold that one to myself. Then once they go through a couple of challenges, usually 3, stories like 3s, right? So the first challenge, he gets a little bit more heroic. Second challenge, more heroic. Third challenge, he's quite heroic now. And at the end, there's always the reversal of fortune. Okay, when you think, oh my God, will he actually make it? Alien was good for this. Remember, you think Ripley has got off, the ship, and you think, okay, she's got off, and of course the monster comes back. But in this case, Luke sort of loses. You think he's going to lose out, and eventually he wins and gets the processional way and all the goodies at the end. So that's the hero's journey. But in a lot of work that we do, we're not interested in that. We're interested in just the stories people tell on a day-to-day basis, the anecdotes. But there's a problem that you can easily face, and I saw this just yesterday actually, where people get so enamored with pretending they have to tell these really fancy stories. They actually fall into what I call like the Uncanny Valley. Has anyone come across the Uncanny Valley as an idea? Yeah? I'll describe it to you. So, these two films that came out in 2004, right? Incredibles actually was incredibly successful, and The Polar Express was an absolute flop. Now, they had very similar approaches to making the movies, good storylines, but this one, when people came out of it, they were asked what they thought of the movie, they inevitably sort of said that they felt a bit creepy. The movie made them feel creepy. And one of the reasons is that they tried to make the humans, the characters in this, absolutely human-like. With the hairs on their arms and all the facial features. Whereas this, look at the characters there, they're obviously not really human. Now, as a Japanese researcher in the 70s, he showed that you can make a robot more and more human. We actually like it for a little bit. I'll show you. So I'll just ignore the axes at the moment, just look at the curve. So you can as you make it more and more human-like, the likability goes up, until it gets to a point where it just dumps into what he called the Uncanny Valley, where we get creeped out by it. And then it's only when it gets right up perfectly human-like that we're okay with it. So you think of Blade Runner or something like that. Great robots up there. Now, I think the same happens with storytelling. Right? So some people, they start off with their just recounting little anecdotes. You can get a little bit better by being more Big S-like. But what happens is you can try too hard, right? And start to get the story voice, and you want to tell this like you're sort of thinking you're getting into sort of theatrical approach. When you do that, you've fallen into this uncanny valley, right? You got to just make it very simple and basic. Has anyone, I guess a lot of you would have seen Modern Family. I love Modern Family, and I saw this clip in Modern Family, which I think sort of illustrates this point, okay? Where Cam probably has fallen into this space here. I'll show you.
I don't know what's worse, that he competes every Thanksgiving in a pie eating contest, or that he's 9-time runner-up.
It wouldn't be Thanksgiving without the contest.
Yes, it would.
I think I have to tell my pumpkin chocolate story.
Oh, no, you don't have to.
No, I don't think I have to.
Once Cam and his friends tried to slingshot a pumpkin across a football field. 3 seconds. That's all you need to tell that story.
So the fog was rolling in over the mountains like an ominous blanket as he ready the giant slingshot. Lorna, the pastor's daughter, she was nervous because, like I said, It was after curfew. She was a goody two-shoe, only pastor's daughter I ever met that was. So we finally launched the pumpkin, and it sails through the air, goalpost to goalpost, past the end zone, into the parking lot, through the open roof of Lorna's dad's car. I turn to Cody, and I say, now what are the chances of that landing there? He says where, and I say, the sunroof of a preacher man. Wah, wah.
Yeah, so sort of went too far, I think, you know. Fell right into that uncanny valley. So, you know, when you're, you know, working in the business environment, you know, keep right down that small S end. You know, the interesting thing, you know, you sort of think, oh, you know, we do a lot of work teaching people the NAB, better storytellers, and one of the things that they get worried about is that, oh, won't people know that we're sort of telling a story, and don't they just want the facts? You know, we just want to get the facts across. Well, the reality is, unless you sort of start off by saying, I'm going to tell you a story, which, by the way, you should never do, right? Never use the S word in business, right? Once you start just recounting, like, oh, you know, just the other day, this happened and this happened, you can actually put all the facts in the story, and because it's in that story structure, it'll be heaps more memorable. You know, people will actually have an impact on it. So, using the story, keeping it down that end is very important. Okay, now, we could talk a lot about the different types of stories, but what I want us to do now is sort of start thinking about some of our own stories. And one of the very simple ways is for us to get around these tables and just, we're going to spend, you know, maybe 10 minutes sharing some examples with one another, just around one question. So when you're doing your work in the development area, just share an example where you've seen a small thing make a big difference. Right? Where you've seen a small thing make a big difference. Now, as you're sitting here and you hear that question, most of you will be sitting there going, I have no idea. I've got absolutely nothing. Right? But this is the really interesting thing about stories. There'll be someone at your table who does come up with an idea. And they'll sort of say, you know what, actually just last week I had something that a small thing made a big difference. And they'll tell the story. And as they're telling the story, through that, there'll be something that triggers your own remembering. And you'll go, oh, yeah, I've got an example as well. And bang, next thing you know, you've got an example. And we're going to be leveraging a little of that sort of dynamic for when we talk about anecdote circles later on in the session. Because that's the dynamic you want to do if you want to collect lots of stories around a system issue or you know, how you might design the software that you're building. So anyway, let's get around the tables, sort of even up the numbers around each of the tables. The thing about this is you just relax into it. You don't have to worry. It doesn't matter if there's silences to start with. It's always, it takes a bit of time to warm into it. And you're going to spend 10 minutes seeing if we can share a couple of examples where a small thing made a difference in your working areas. Yeah, introduce yourselves.
I'm Michael.
Claire, nice to meet Sorry. I can't even remember something about small things. We have to come up with a story.
I was actually telling a story. I'm saying I have a story.
I'm putting you up the spot. No, we have to come up with an example first. It's sounding like Mr. McFine now.
Actually, I had an example yesterday. We're in a they feel like they can't. So Yeah. So it's actually the rooms. It's very straightforward. You've got place for screen, but like this one, so then project on there. Yeah, I have like a wireless keyboard and mouse to do that. And now I'm like, just so we're trying to get some so scripts that will get you very more how we can do this is people talking about it. They want to do it. So one of the VAs, she ran out of the room. And I suppose you put it this way, in our environment, the story information actually writing things down. Pretty calm, talking about them, sharing it. Completely different. So after someone started writing one, other people they're sort of a bit resistant to stuff. But you know, I've practiced before, so I'm used to making sure that you actually had a whole table full of questions. Right. So people went from having
Feeling
and uncomfortable to doing something totally different. Well, we got them to just do a great enough of everything they needed to. Yeah, then we could do something
Not too much evaluation to it. One thing that we
great. It's always hard to know how to shoot.
But it's in the address book. That would have been on the
Great idea. I think we're going down this road.
I see what's going on. Just 2 minutes ago. I've got a story. Just 2 minutes ago. Small thing. Okay, so left field. So I do improvisation contests on a Tuesday night. So just the other Tuesday night, I was running in the group. Exercises in improvisation, and most people are generally fairly hesitant to start interacting, especially when it becomes physical. And one of the points that the woman made was from an improvisation perspective, to concentrate on your partner and make your partner look. So when you partner up with somebody for an exercise, to make your partner look, concentrate on them having a good time, concentrate on them looking good, and by default that takes away any of that fear. So for me, it was such a small learning in terms of improvisation and performance, but in terms of my work throughout the day, in terms of agile and collaboration, I brought that back and tried to do the same thing in collaboration in terms of sort of putting, instead of showboating what I know, spend the time doing a round table where we were scrumming, spending time trying to make each of my counterparts.
My boss is a Essendon fan.
I spend time more in worrying about whether they were people's fear element kind of dropped away. So very small change in the way that you interacting
makes a very big difference in terms of collaboration. So from an agile perspective, someone.
That reminds me so I'm talking to my colleagues. So I want to share something that I hate getting up there and doing. And I'm with this new team at the moment. I'm with the high school. And I've asked them whether I could present to them. And so, the thing that made such a big difference was one of the guys said, I don't know why you're nervous. And I was like, I was really worried that I'll say something wrong. And he's like, yeah, no one's like going there to see you. Like, no one's walking in that room going, oh, I'm clear crowd. And I was like, oh, it's so true. And he's like, just focus on that. Like, it just made me feel so much better. So it was such like a, and probably an obvious point, but I was like, oh yeah, that's so true. Like, no one really wants to say I'm proud.
Okay, everyone, let's finish up those stories. It's always hard to get to stop a story or something like that. So, actually, one of the things I love energy goes up when you do this sort of stuff, right? It's fantastic. And in fact, one of the things I really love watching, when people start to recount stories, their body language changes. So when you're just sort of listening to someone standing up talking, you tend to take, see what you just did there? Yeah. And this, like, prove it. How good are you? Right? As soon as the stories are told, people they lean in and the whole body language is totally different. It's just fascinating to watch, to change that energy.
Well, what's also interesting, Shawn, is that they've said to learn languages, it's much better to be dramatic and to act out, to have kind of stories, and that somehow in our brains are much more receptive to what's new, rather than just sitting and going to the grammar or speaking timidly. It's like, get over the top. So I think that's an interesting thing about how
probably forces you to do that a little
the
bit.
story is like it does enliven the brain.
Yeah, good. What other things did you notice as you were just doing that? What was some of the things that just sprung to mind as you were just sharing some super stories?
Well, recollection was one of the things. So I was struggling to think of a story, but after listening to a couple of guys, I have one as well.
Yep, so the penny just drops. Yeah. It's actually really hard to collect stories from an individual. Have you ever tried to do that? Sitting down the old interview style and trying to actually get stories from them. If you read what the oral historians have to do in preparation to actually get stories from people, it's phenomenal. You have to get a lot of history of the person, things that they do, so you can trigger their own life events. But when you've got a group of people around a table, they're doing that for you. Everyone's bringing their own life experience there, and then all these things start to happen. Yeah. Anything else that people observe?
We could have kept talking.
Yeah.
But you interrupted us.
Yeah.
Interrupted our story.
Interrupted a story, yeah. It feels terrible when you interrupt someone's story, doesn't it?
It's a much more natural form of communication.
Yeah, right. I mean, we do it, you have a dinner party, that's what we do. And you tell a whole bunch of stories and a bunch of people get together. It's always the thing that we do. So I guess what I want to do next, well actually not next but soon, is to look at, if you're going to facilitate something like this, what are the sort of questions you ask? What's the form of the questions? Because there are actually very different types. There are some questions that get you opinions, and there are some questions that get you stories, right? And just a hint, if you like, why would that get you stories?
Because it gives you time starter.
That's right, time marker immediately. See? So stories start with a time marker and a place marker, so when and where questions tend to do very well in getting you stories. Whereas we love why questions, right? Actually, I was doing this work for an executive team, and they were sharing little examples, little things that they do to make a difference. And one executive sort of said to me, or said to the group, he said, look what I have in front of my little notebook. And in the front he had written in big letters, never ask why. Right? Because as soon as as an executive, he asks why, people claim up because they feel like they're being judged, they're sort of, there's something going on, and what he wants to get at the nub of it. He said he doesn't ever have to ask why. He asks when and where. They tell him these stories, and he understands why. So this is what you're after. You're sort of after when and where. But that's just a prelude to what we'll do, because I want to now quickly move, we don't have that much time, I want to quickly move into just a simple story structure you can use if you want to sort of convince another group of some activity that you're doing, right? And you want to help them understand really why. Why is this important now? And the structure goes like this. We call them strategic stories, and they have a very basic structure. And that is, so in the past it was like this, and then something happened, and as a result of that we're going to do this, so that in the future it can be like that. It's a very simple structure. You'll find that these two components are the most story-like. This tends to be a bit, dot pointy, in the sense that, we're going to do these three things, but then this can be story-like as well. You can tell this as a future story. And these things really come alive when you bring your own experiences to it. We call them moments. Okay, so you take your various individual moments and you sort of populate them. So everyone has if you like, a different variation of the main story. So imagine if you had 20 developers and you want to be able to convey to the business why this development is so important. You can sort of say, in the business, it was like this in the past. But you know what? The business environment changed in some way. There were some real major reasons why we needed to do this development. So as a result of that, we're doing this, this, and this, because in the future, then you tell the story of the future of development. But you don't want everyone, if you just have a script, right, and everyone says the same script, authenticity, down, right? You don't want that. You want people to be able, each developer, to be able to tell their own story. So you help them find their own experiences. So it might be, here at the moment, GFC comes up in this one all the time, right? And so with the GFC, there might be a story that an individual developer has when that really impacted him or her, right? So they can tell their own story. So then they sort of say, yeah, and the GFC hit, and sort of say, yeah, I remember, I was actually at that time working for JP Morgan, and this happened. And that just gives people an illustration of the impact of that particular event, but from the person who's telling it, rather than the script that's given to you by the company. With all these things, it's always good to have an example, and I found a perfect one from this fellow. It's the last keynote he gave, when he was introducing iCloud, okay? And he uses this structure perfectly, okay? And so I'm going to show you the video of him doing that. But there's another element in it that's really important in story work, and we call them anti-stories. So for every official story, there'll be a story that combats it from the rest of the group. So say if you're trying to convince the business line that this technology development is really required for all these reasons, they'll have an alternative story. If it's stronger than yours, will beat yours. So you have to preempt it and build in their anti-story into your story. Right? I'll give you a little example. We're doing some work for a government agency, government department in Queensland. And they're putting two agencies together. And I was working with the executive team, and they've developed their strategic story, and they're very happy with it. And I sort of said, okay, well, what are the anti-stories? And I told them what an anti-story was. And they all groaned together. They went, I'm like, oh, okay, this could be interesting. And I said, so, well, what happened? He said, well, 10 years ago, we actually put these two departments together. And they lasted 2 years and we split them apart. Everyone calls it the big divorce. So now that we're coming back together again, the anti-story is, oh, just wait 2 years and they'll split apart again. Right? So they then had to address that anti-story in their strategic story. They had to say why it was different now, what happened before, so they had to be right up front with it. Now you'll see Steve Jobs does that also in his introduction of iCloud. Okay? So just watch, I'd like you to watch how he presents it and the sort of language he uses. And what I've done is I've actually marked the top of the sort of video with the structure, so you'll be able to see each component of the story as it comes along. Okay? And we'll have a look at that.
So I get to talk about iCloud. We've been working on this for some time now, and we're really excited about it. About 10 years ago, we had one of our most important insights, and that was that the PC was going to become the digital hub for your digital life. What did that mean? Well, it meant that that's where you were going to put your digital photos. Where else were you going to put it? Your digital video off your digital camcorder. And of course, your music, right? You were going to acquire it in the device or potentially on your Mac. And you were going to basically sync it to the Mac, and everything was going to work fine. And it did for the better part of 10 years. But it's broken down in the last few years. Why? Well, because the devices have changed. They now all have music. They now all have photos. They now all have video. And so if I acquire a song, I buy it right on my iPhone. I want to get that to my other devices. Or I pick up my iPad and it doesn't have that song on it. So I have to sync my iPhone to my Mac. Then I have to sync my other devices to the Mac to get that song. But then they've deposited some photos on the Mac, so I have to sync the iPhone again with the Mac to get those photos. And keeping these devices in sync is driving us crazy. So, we've got a great solution for this problem. And we think this solution is our next big insight, which is we're going to demote the PC and the Mac to just be a device. Just like an iPhone, an iPad, an iPod. And we're going to move the digital hub, the center of your digital life, in the cloud. Because all these new devices have communication built into them. They can all talk to the cloud whenever they want. And so now, if I get something on my iPhone, it's sent up to the cloud immediately. Let's say I take some pictures with it. Those pictures are in the cloud, and they are now pushed down to my devices completely automatically. And now everything's in sync with me not even having to think about it. I don't even have to take the devices out of my pocket. I don't have to be near my Mac or PC. Now, some people think the cloud is just a hard disk in the sky, right? And you take a bunch of stuff and you put it in your Dropbox or your iDisk or whatever, and it transfers it up to the cloud and stores it, and then you drag whatever you want back out on your other devices. We think it's way more than that, and we call it iCloud. Now, iCloud stores your content in the cloud and wirelessly pushes it to all your devices. So it automatically uploads it, stores it, and automatically pushes it to all your other devices. But also, it's completely integrated with your apps. And so everything happens automatically, and there's nothing new to learn. It just all works. It just works. Now, you might ask, why should I believe them? They're the ones that brought me Mobile Me. It wasn't our finest hour. Let me just say that. But we learned a lot. Now, the three core apps in Mobile Me were Contacts, Calendar, and Mail. Three things we obviously kept up to date. We've thrown them away. We've re-architected and rewritten them from the ground up to be iCloud apps. So that is iCloud.
So, I've always found it interesting looking at that. What did you notice? What were some of the things that jumped out for you? And how he's presenting that case?
Definitely the anti-story. He's killed an anti-story.
Yes, he certainly
Killed a
addressed
couple of
him.
anti-stories.
Yeah, and he did it very quickly too. It's not like he hung around and talked, at length about these things. He just admitted that was a stuff up, and we learned from it. Just quickly moved on. But he took all the energy out of that. For all those people who'd be ready to sort of say, oh yeah, but Mobile Me was such a disaster, and you're just going to create a new Mobile Me, aren't you? And it just gets quashed. Yeah.
And the sense that they've learnt something from that mistake.
Yes, that's right. They've reflected on it. They've sort of gone through and could do it better this time. Yeah.
The unexpected thing was that they've thrown away their fundamental insight from a decade ago that's been so successful.
Yes, and that's the thing, the bit that's unanticipated. It's not a story, remember, unless there's something unanticipated. And what's the core of the strategy that he was suggesting? What's the basic element of that strategy?
Channel everything through us and we'll take a percentage.
See, that's another anti-story to address. Right?
That's what they do.
It's called business.
It was to sell the cloud.
Sorry?
It was to sell the iCloud.
Sell the iCloud, that's absolutely true. What was the sort of bold move that they were making?
Demoting them.
Yeah. That's the big thing they were doing. This was, okay, in the past the PC was the centre. No longer, it's down here. It's like any other device.
Strategy.
The cloud is the centre.
And I think that's what's so unusual about what he was able to do compared with a lot of other companies, that they just cannot let go of what has made them successful to date, and they don't see the future's already arrived, and it's in a totally different dynamic. And he saw it and followed it, and I just think you have a lot of companies that can't emotionally or psychologically acknowledge that.
Yeah, just on the code.
But we've made so much money out of that.
Did you also notice that he spoke about the future as if it was happening now?
Yeah. It is.
But now this happens. Like magic. This was a year before iCloud came out when he gave this talk. So it's this interesting idea if you can sort of really paint the picture of what's happening, in the future as if it's happening now. That's a very powerful way of conveying your idea. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a little snapshot of how you can take a really basic sort of story structure. So in the past, then something happened. Actually, there's a famous storyteller called Shawn Callahan. He sort of says, stories are people plus place plus trouble, right? And so the then something happened is usually some problem. And he sort of said, it was driving him crazy. He was showing the frustration of the problem that they were facing, so that he'd get on to sort of say, and now this is what we're doing, demoting that PC, putting the iCloud up there. So in the future, and then he talked about what was going to work in the future. So use that over and over again. You'll find it's a really powerful and simple way to convey what you're doing, and more importantly, why you're doing it. Everyone wants to know why. Why is it different now? Look, in the last sort of 30 minutes that we have, I think we need to get into this whole, how do you elicit stories? How do you sort of get these stories from the various people that you're working with? And it all comes down really to the questions that you're asking and how you facilitate these, what I call anecdote circles. And in fact, we wrote an ebook, a short ebook, maybe 20, 30 pages long, that takes you through all the steps of how to run an anecdote circle. And we were obviously filled with hubris when we wrote this, because we called it the ultimate guide to anecdote circles. I don't know why. We were sort of, but this, you'll find it just if you just go to our website, which is www.anecdote.com. And yeah, just look for the anecdote circle guide, and that'll sort of take you through step by step sort of things that we do anyway that seem to work. But it comes down to questions. So I guess what I'd like for us to do is maybe for everyone just to spend 2 minutes writing down, say, 2 questions. Say if you're trying to, what's a typical thing that you're trying to find when you're developing a system you think stories would be helpful? Give me some ideas here, just so I can give you something that's a bit more contextual than what I have in mind. What sort of thing?
What is your job frustrating?
Frustrating, okay. So you're trying to find out examples of things that make frustrating for you in the way you do your job and the process that's around that. So I want you to write down a couple of questions, just 2 questions, which you're going to ask directly the person you're interviewing those questions, and we're going to sort of see whether they're questions that get you stories or whether they're questions that get you something else. Okay? So you're trying to get a sense of what might frustrate them. And you can't ask, give me a story about what makes you frustrated. I know, you were thinking that, weren't you? Okay, 2 minutes to do that, and then we'll have a bit of a play around with those questions. Yeah, we'll be good. Everyone got a couple of questions written down? Okay, I want you to find a partner, and you're going to ask the question, your first question, and sort of see what happens. See what you get. Grab a partner, introduce yourself, and if it doesn't work out exactly on pairs, group of 3 would work as well, so just grab someone, ask the question, and see what you get.
What's this question? Whether it's good thing if it doesn't work and it doesn't, maybe a fundamental change in the way I do work. Yes. Do you want to ask? Stories that are the case. Tricky. Hang on, I'm listening to stories. We're listening to that story. I work and you get all the time.
Try to ask me the other no. I get frustrated easily too. I actually always do get lots of questions.
Your question is better. They haven't even given you my question.
Well, I so what's the work? So like there's work
So I ask questions which are more specific to our work. So how does it currently work? Any other questions you ask? Just too direct.
They can often get there, but I think when you say Chris, it's straight, and they go, oh, they get there, and then you go, there's like, if you're in that frame of mind, they're like, Jake, those constrictions left, and I think, I love that. And you can always try and target what you know, once you've shown them whereas so if they were removed,
Let's wrap that one up. Sounds like there are lots of questions asked. Right, okay. I'd like
we don't want to say things like that about work, but everyone's to be like, oh yeah, I feel like
terrific. Lots of questions and answers there. But I'd like to give some examples of the questions people asked. Like, for example, let's start with maybe an example. He asked the question and you felt like you got a story straight away. Anyone have that example?
What was the strangest customer request you've ever had?
Right, nice.
And
nice.
flipped with what's the hardest?
Yep, okay. And you got an example, a specific example? Terrific, that's good. Good. What about other examples?
What have you seen lately that surprised you or was been unexpected?
Yes, because of course stories are unexpected and surprising. So interesting, of course, these are both what questions, which are not what I was talking about. Yeah. But that's all right, because there's exceptions to all this. One of my best story listening questions is a what question. Yes.
When was the last time you had, a terrible week at work?
Right. Yep. Absolutely. Now, the interesting thing about that question is that we actually remember our stories sort of based on at least two important things. One is we remember what we feel. Okay. So if you can help people get back to an emotion, so when you felt frustrated or terrible, there's more than likely they'll actually have a story to be able to tell you around that, if they've had an experience like that. So emotion is really important to use as a way to trigger stories. The other thing that we tend to attach our stories to is pictures, right? And the funny thing is, you can actually throw out a couple of sort of picture examples, and it may not be. I'll give you an example because it sounds a bit abstract otherwise. So, for example, I could be looking for examples of performance reviews. I might be interested in performance reviews and what happened in their last performance review. And I can sort of say, look, you might have had your performance review in your boss's office, or perhaps it was just informally in the cafeteria. Right? So it creates two pictures for them. They go, boss's office looks like this, and then the other picture, and it might be neither of those things, but they quickly find the next picture. Something their brains tend to do very well is to be able to remember those images of when things have actually happened. So using those two things in your stories, in your questions, can be very effective. Any other examples that people came up with?
I thought this was a good one. What constraints do you get at work?
Oh, okay, right. And did you feel like you got a story, or did you have to work hard to get the story after you asked the question?
No, they just came tumbling out. They could have just tumbling out and
yes.
just opened up a whole can.
Yes.
I'm frustrated.
Now, though, you've got to be careful with questions sometimes like that. We're all primed to tell stories, right? Because we're in this story, activity. But sometimes when you ask, what is your view on something, or what is most important, people will say, they'll give a series of opinions. They'll sort of say, well, what's important around here is this, and it's always been like that, and there's, and quite frankly, no matter what we do to try to get this done, this will always knock it over. You get that type of language, and that's opinion, right? And what you need to do from there, I remember when I learned how to run anecdote circles, the lady Sharon Darwin, who taught me all about it, she said, you only need to know two things to run a good anecdote circle. She said, first of all, you just have to say, whenever they tell you something and they're very dogmatic about it, you just say, oh, can you give me an example? Simple as that. And then the second thing is you actually have to be comfortable with silence. And this is the hardest bit because we've got all these ideas, we've been analysing this system, and we throw out the question, and they're not answering straight away. So you go, boom, what about this? What about that? And they're not answering. You go, you have to actually sit back, and it's really interesting what happens. The pause. You just sort of sit there and you just throw in the first question, and you just sit there, and it feels like forever, right? And it's almost painful. But what happens is that they're just trying to recall an experience. Apparently, if they're looking up, left and right, you know what this? That means they're actually thinking and they're looking for experiences. If they just start looking straight back at you, they've got nothing. So you got to keep moving, right? So it's allowing them that time to actually get. And sometimes they will not have an experience straight away. And so one of the things I do, if I'm having trouble getting some stories out, I'll jump up on a whiteboard and I'll do a timeline. Right? And it's very, very effective because in a timeline, you're still in the story mode. You sort of say, okay, well, what were the key events that occurred over the last 2 years? And I'll sort of say, oh, well, we had the, sort of combine these two departments here. We had the new boss arrive here. We go, oh, okay, so what actually happened around there? What do you remember as most significant there? And they sort of say, well, we really had a change. Oh, can you give an example? And that sort of helps you build up these stories as you go along. What about from your experience in collecting stories? Well, what are some of the things that you found that worked really well, and or things that you thought might have worked well and were just a real pain? Do you collect stories in groups? When you do it?
Well, beer works pretty well.
Yeah, I do too. That food and drink, beer particularly. Yeah, doesn't always work in every workplace.
Sometimes I just ask people if they just show me what they do.
Right.
Just say, just talk me through what you do, show me what you do, and that way I can actually see a lot easier than actually asking them the questions and not asking all the right ones.
Right, and this is really interesting because I'll give you two little examples of why the show me what you do can be really powerful. And these are two mistakes I've made, I suppose. The first mistake was working with a guy who was like the network controller for Australian Energy. And so he knew where all the electricity grid and how it was all connected and all the substations, and he was retiring. And my job was to go in and collect as much knowledge as we could because he had such a pivotal role. And he was in this room that had maps on the wall and televisions and had a window into the control room so you could see all the guys working in there and what they were doing. And so I was asking him, what his experiences were. He'd be pulling these maps out of these map cabinets like this, and he'd tell me, well, this substation in 1974, and we connected this one over here, and this happened, and he'd break telling all these stories. But we ran out of time, and he retired. And he sort of said, look, Shawn, I'm quite happy for you to come to my house and continue on the process, which I did about a month later, sitting in just a normal sort of lounge room and had the pictures of the kids there and sort of the ducks flying up the wall. And well, I asked him the question. It's almost like he had a lobotomy. He couldn't remember any of his stories, and all the experience sort of disappeared. And I got this feeling that his room was just full of these triggers of his own experience. And in the workplace, you sort of go to where they work, and there's all these things that remind them of what they're doing. So I think that's, if you can do that, that has an enormous power. Yeah. My second stuff up was actually getting a whole bunch of gardeners from the Australian Botanic Gardens into a workshop room like this. They had their shears in their side pocket and their green uniforms on. And I've never seen a group of blokes, mainly blokes, look so uncomfortable. Right? They just didn't want to be there. So we got them all out. We went into this big shed, their garden shed, and had their trucks up one side, and planks down the middle, and it was a standing event. It was one of the best little workshops we did because it was in their environment. And it also reminded them of what they actually knew. So that's a really good point. What about other sort of techniques people use?
I was in a situation where I was in a top secret defence institute, and these people were staying in Melbourne, and the whole thing was moving to Canberra.
Yeah.
So their entire working life they'd been trained not to say anything. And I had to sort of interview them. And so I then walk up and you just scan the desk and you go, you've got 2 kids. Let's talk about the kids. You support, Hawthorn. I'm a Richmond supporter, blah, blah, blah. And you just try and build the quick instant bond, relate And that built a little bit of trust, and then you'd say, okay, here I am. You have to tell me all you know about this thing. I know you've never told anyone else in your life, not the person who sits next to you, tell me.
Yeah.
And that taught me a lot about, just trying to instantly,
build
get a good
rapport.
communication.
Yeah, it's so true. And I know when I run Anecdote circles, I make sure that as people are coming in, you do all the chit-chat, and do the sort of things that you were talking about, just so that they feel comfortable, so that when they start talking, it's this relaxed environment where all of a sudden, it's the most amazing thing when you get a group of people around a table and you're talking about something and people will say things like, and you're recording the whole thing, they'll say, look, this mustn't go outside this room. And then they just lay it on the line in terms of what's really happening there. There's something about stories that open people up to that. In fact, there have been times where I had to warn them that it was being recorded and we were going to use it in other processes, because you sort of have to act as a steward for these people as well. You have to protect them as well as collect their information. So that's part of the process, I think. So I guess just to give you some of the things that I find useful, definitely trying to conjure those pictures, the emotion, using the language, their language, learning their language as much as possible. So you know the acronyms, the way in which they speak. I mean, it can actually be a real downer if you're sort of using one set of language and they're coming from a totally different space. You lose a lot of connection that happens. Obviously, open questions is where you want to go. Though, mind you, sometimes a closed question can be really good to just sort of shake them a little bit so that they can sort of say yes or no to, and then you can ask for an example. And even though I sort of said when and where questions generally get you stories, we already saw quite a good set of examples of what will get you good stories, especially if the what question is focusing in on a happening. So just by saying, so what happened? They'd be telling you about, we get a lot of change in management in this organisation. Oh, so what happened when that last occurred? Next thing you know, you get a story out of it. And here, sometimes, rather than just asking, when you've been frustrated, you can actually ask both ends. You can sort of say, when have you felt most frustrated? Or at the other end of the spectrum, when things have really worked perfectly for you and you felt like you were in the groove. So it gives them the option which end they go to. And the other thing I find too, sometimes you can use a sort of middle of the road question, which is around, and it's a bit like the question you asked, when have you been surprised? When did something jump out at you just did not expect? And it could be did not expect because it was so good, or did not expect because it was so bad. Right? So again, they can sort of go either way. So yeah, building up these questions are a key part. I get the sort of techniques we use, a range of different techniques. So the anecdote circles is a big one. But observation, going into the workplace, as you're sort of saying, doing interviews where you're just focusing on getting stories, one-on-one interviews, and like I sort of said before, you have to put effort into, I suppose, the preparation before you walk in the door. You know a lot about that person. Naive interview is an interesting one. This is where you actually employ people who don't know really anything about the business. So, for example, I did a project for the New Zealand Tax Office where we were interested in the grey economy. And particularly, we started off with one industry which was motor mechanics, and we didn't want consultants rocking up to motor mechanics and asking them all these questions about the dodgy business dealings. Because we knew they're not going to tell us. So we employed a range of PhD students, first, second year into their PhD, and they went out and they knew, exactly what it was about and what organisation they were with, but they felt just more comfortable in sharing their stories around this particular area of cash economy, essentially. And what was really interesting is that we did that with the mechanics, or the mechanic owners. We also did it with hairdressers as well, who were both great at cash business. And then also did it with the people inside the tax office to get what their perceptions were of those industries. Because what we're interested in to see is where the cultural clashes were between what they were doing. Because what the tax office wanted to do was form a closer relationship with those industries so that they could help them understand, you know, how to do this better in terms of their tax returns. Fingers crossed, though. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Slight anti-story.
Yeah, that's right. Slight anti-story. So this is what I think the anecdote circles look like for us. You know, a bit like a good dinner party discussion. That rapport bit is so important. Actually, have you seen that movie? Is it called Kinsey or McKinsey, about the sex researcher? Sort of one of those fairly, what you call it, narrow-casted movies, I think. But what's interesting, because he had to do a lot of interviewing, asking people about their sex lives, and he was teaching his sort of researchers of how to do it. And it was exactly that, you know. He said, no, you can't just jump in and ask them these questions. You've got to give them water, have a cup of tea, and, you know, all the other things that he did, just so you can ask the tough questions. You know, this number can actually vary a bit. It's hard to get below about 6, or, you know, because you need that dynamic of people bouncing off each other. You can probably go up to 12, 14, 16 even, but then what happens is the sort of dynamic breaks down in terms of who can participate. You get people who just sit there and just listen. We've run rooms where we've had 10 tables all running anecdote circles sort of simultaneously, so you can get lots and lots of people doing it. But in those situations, you can't get people recording it because there's just too much noise in the room. But what you can do is have someone actually writing down the key points of the stories. So we did this with the Victorian Bushfire Reconstruction Authority. So after the bushfires, they had something like 30-odd different, what they call community recovery committees. And what they found is that each CRC was head down, bum up, just trying to get their community back up to speed, but they weren't learning any lessons from the communities around them. So we did this activity where we connected them all by brought in 300 of their leaders into one room and got them to tell stories of when a small thing made a big difference, because like what you were sort of saying. Some of those stories were heartbreaking. But what was really interesting is that we got people around the table, they would tell their story, and then we would just get people to sort of take note of the story that really grabbed them the most. And then they had to go to another table, we mix everyone up, they'd go to another table, and they would tell it again, and then we'd go to another table, and they would tell it a third time. And then I got all 300 people to stand up, and then go to the person that the story struck them the most and put their hand on their shoulder. And it was this massive 300-person sort of social network analysis of where the most powerful stories were. Now, normally when I do that, I would then get the person which has got all the hands on their shoulder to tell their story. But in this case, I couldn't, because you could imagine what the story would be that they would tell. It would be too traumatic for them to actually tell that. So what they did was on their story card, they just wrote how many hands were on their shoulder. And what you ended up getting was this really nice data set of the stories, plus the stories which were most powerful. And we put them up on a wall, and then we start to use them in a whole range of different ways in that particular day. But if you want to get a snapshot of the situation, you know, from a whole bunch of users, you know, you could probably use that technique. If you want to look it up, it's called Jumpstart Storytelling. I think we've written it up on our website, but it's quite a nice. It has a couple of purposes. One is it's really great for connecting a big group of people very quickly, because you only know someone when you know their stories. You know, as soon as you start sharing a story with someone. But then the other thing is it's great for collecting lots of stories quickly. It's funny, you know, when we started recording stories, it's funny where you start, because we started with almost like the microphone setups you would use in a legal proceeding, with each person with a microphone. It was very intimidating until we finally found that you can actually get a digital recorder and stick that on the table. So that's actually a much better way to go. And there's a couple of things you can do to, I guess these are the things that happen which cause you pain within an anecdote circle, right? So one of the things that can cause you pain is when you have a group of people and they vary in their levels in the organisation. Right? Someone is more senior. And often, they will hear a story and they don't even have to say anything. They just have to roll their eyes or just look askance. And next thing you know, no more stories come out. Right? So wherever possible, I try to get everyone at the same level, you know, in the anecdote circle. The other thing is sometimes you'll get someone who just cannot shut up. Right? They just want to tell you absolutely everything. Right? If you know before you walk in who that person is, sit them right next to you. Right? Because what happens is that they have to look at all their colleagues and they're not looking at you. Harder for them to look at you. If they sit across from you, they look straight at you and they want to tell you everything because you're the new guy, you know nothing, right? So they want to tell you everything about, and all the colleagues are just going, oh my God. But if you put them next to you, they have to tell their colleagues who already know. So it dampens them down. And if that doesn't work, one other thing I sometimes do is sort of say, I give the role of a note keeper. So I'll sort of say before I start, sometimes it's really useful to have just a bit of a note keeper. I'll start, you know, and if someone then gets garrulous, you sort of say, oh, Jenny, could you mind doing the note keeping for a little while? Hard to talk and note keep at the same time. So, you know, you have to sort of see different ways in which to sort of get that space working as best as you can. What are some of the things that have happened to you that have thrown you or, you know, you've had to deal with in trying to collect stories of, or even, you know, sort of how people work in workplaces?
Sometimes I've found it hard to get to unearth the real story, especially with that hierarchy.
Yeah.
Where you get a sort of management perception of what is really going on, and and it's been really enlightening when you get that honest, frank opinion of what may be occurring.
And what do you have you tended to do to try to get that real story?
I think I was lucky enough in this one particular scenario that the chap who gave the real story was very straightforward and straight up, and he just wouldn't accept the sort of management veneer, and he just sort of said his piece, and that was great.
Right.
Yeah, but I've never really had to confront the...
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it?
How to break down that barrier of...
Yeah, it's sort of like trying to keep an eye out for those people who might actually tell you that. But I think some of it's going back to going into the workplace and sort of seeing it happening. I know when I did work as a developer a number of years ago, one of the things our development team did, and we were working in one of these defence secret places, we moved our development team right inside the middle of all the people who were developing the system for them. And of course, it's not like they were holding things back particularly, but they just didn't know. You know, just didn't have it in their head. It's this idea that you only know what you know when you need to know it. You know, it's very contextual what you know. And so it was really interesting to be sitting there, you know, just working away, doing your thing, and then one of the guys would say, you'd say something, and you go, oh, gee, I've never heard of one of those before. And you go over and sort of say, well, what's that? Oh, yeah, this is an ad hoc thing, happens, you know, every 3 to 18 months, and you know, he tells you about some acceptance situation that you would never pick up if you went through what the standard process was. So I think one of those ways could be useful too. But any other people, any other suggestions?
Cross-cultural issues. So we have an offshore team, and they are culturally not. It's not culturally normal to bring problems up.
Yeah. How do you get around that?
We spend significant sums on cross-cultural awareness training, and do what you're doing. Like, so, I don't, you know, in a former life as an agile consultant, I'd be the facilitator, but as the guy who they report to, I don't take the facilitation role until their peers.
Yes. Yeah, I do a bit of work up in Singapore and you know, running workshops, and what I found there is that if I ask a Singaporean audience a question, sort of like this, so what do you think? I'll get nothing. Right? But if I get them talking in their tables, which we're more than happy to do, and then go over to the table and sort of say, oh, you guys have had a really good talk. So what are the key things there? You know, you'll get, you know, a response. That's just one little thing I found that tends to work in this space. Yeah, so we've got to try, I guess with this sort of stuff, you just have to try things out. You know? I guess the last thing I'd say is that I put this up in when I run Anecdote circles, or a variation of this. And sort of like these 3 rules that people need to adhere to. The first one being that, you know, we want people to provide their experiences, their real life examples, and we also want people to allow them. One of the abnormal bits of an anecdote circle when you're actually recording it is that people in a normal situation talk over top of one another or help each other out with a story. So someone will start the story, someone will jump in and tell a few bits, and then someone else will. Well, it's really hard for our transcribers to deal with that, so we get them to actually finish their story before the next story starts. And which leads on to the last one, and that is we don't want people to disagree. We want just them to tell their own story. And this is where you sort of get the multiple versions out of how things work, because everyone has their own perception of how things happen in an organisation. I mean, I had a classic example working at a coal-fired power station. So working with the sort of frontline guys, you know, hard hat blokes, and they were telling me about this fellow who had come into work, and as he was from Malaysia, this is sort of a cross-cultural issue. He was coming, he just arrived from Malaysia, it was up in the mountains, just west of Sydney. He was driving into work, he didn't really understand the whole icy road thing, lost control of the car and went into the ditch. And so he just turned his car around and he went home. He said, that's it, I'm not going. And so he ran into work, and he sort of just said that he was going to stay at home, and the guy who answered the phone thought he said because he had 4 beers. Right? And the manager says, 4 beers? What do you mean? You can't be at work and drinking alcohol. You get your ass in here. And he was, anyway, this is the first guy telling the story. Anyway, the next guy said, well, actually, I was the guy who was the manager of that guy. And this is my version of the story. He tells a slightly different version. He says, well, he didn't actually slide off the road, and he didn't go home. There was a slight difference. In the end, it turned out that he wasn't saying he had 4 beers. He said he had phobias. Oh. Right? And this thing, but it really was interesting because it showed how quickly this company escalated issues up the line. It was like escalated right up to one of the senior managers because this poor guy, had a near accident and decided to go home. And he was getting all upset because he said, I'm a Muslim, I don't drink in beers, and he was getting really concerned about this, and he was being maligned and all sorts of things. So, and it was all because of this misunderstanding. But it was really interesting to see 4 different stories told about the same issue, giving quite different perspectives on what actually happened. So, anyway, I think that's probably a good place for us to finish up. It's morning tea now. Thanks very much for your sort of participation. That's really good. And feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. You'll find me there. And if you have any questions, just shoot them off to me, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks.